They say New York never sleeps, but sometimes it weeps. The rain that night wasn't just water. It was grief spilling from clouds that had held too much for too long. In a narrow alley behind a quiet West Village cafe, two strangers met, not with names, not with words, but with a silence so thick it swallowed the city's noise. He was in a tuxedo, soaked, slumped by a dumpster, clutching a gold ring like it was the last piece of a life just shattered. She was a waitress, tired, taking out the trash. And still, she sat beside him. No questions. No assumptions. Just presence. She reached out and pulled him into a hug, the kind that doesn't ask for anything, the kind that says, you don't have to be okay to be held. And when she walked away, she didn't know that the man she comforted was a billionaire tech mogul who had just been left at the altar in front of 300 guests. She didn't know her act of kindness would make headlines. She didn't know he would find her again, not with a limo, but with a book. But fate? Fate knew exactly what it was doing. If you believe in kindness from strangers, if you believe one moment can change two lives forever, comment, I'm with you, Mr. Hearthline, below, and click that subscribe button. It helps this video reach more hearts. The rain wasn't letting up. It pressed down on Manhattan with steady insistence, flattening hair, soaking coats, and pooling at the curbs where yellow cabs splashed through. The city was alive. As ever, neon signs reflecting off wet pavement, horns wailing, footsteps rushing. But behind Camden's Book and Brew, the alleyway felt like another world. Nina Caldwell pushed the heavy metal door with her shoulder, carrying a black trash bag in both. The bag sagged from half-filled espresso grinds, crumpled napkins, and discarded fragments. She had worked a double shift. Her apron was stained, her hoodie damp, and her curls clung to her cheeks. She wanted nothing more than to dump the trash, clock out, and curl up in her tiny studio with leftover noodles. But then she heard it. A sound that cut through the rain. Not shouting. Not laughter. Not even drunken rambling, which was common enough in the village at night. It was crying. Not soft tears. Not sniffles. But deep, raw sobs. The kind that come from the chest, from somewhere people usually keep locked up. Nina froze mid-step, the bag dangling in her grip. She wasn't nosy. She wasn't reckless. Still, something in that sound stopped her from walking. But she dropped the bag by the dumpster and pulled her hood tighter around her face. Her sneakers splashed in the puddles as she followed the sound. That's when she saw him. Slumped against the brick wall beneath a flickering lamp, a man sat in the rain. A tuxedo clung to his frame, the kind tailored to perfection but ruined now by water and grit. His dark hair plastered against his forehead. His hands shook as they clutched something small and golden. A ring. Even from a distance, it caught the light, glinting faintly in the storm. Nina's breath caught. She had seen drunk Wall Streeters pass out in alleys, artists cry over lost loves, customers drown their sorrows in whiskey shots at her bar. But this was different. This wasn't performance. This was grief so naked it felt almost private. She hesitated. Common sense told her to turn back. But her feet wouldn't listen. Instead, it walked forward slowly, like approaching a wild animal that might bolt at sudden movement. To stop just a few feet away. You okay? Her voice was soft but clear, carried by the rain. The man lifted his head slightly, his jaw clenched, eyes red. He didn't look at her. Just shook his head once. No. That was all. One word, heavy as lead. Nina's throat tightened. She wasn't in the mood to play savior. She wasn't the type to force conversations either. She could have left it there. But something about the way he held that ring, something about the way his shoulders curled inward, as if trying to make himself disappear, struck her. She lowered herself to the wet ground beside him. Instantly, the cold water seeped through her jeans, but she didn't flinch. She sat in silence, the rain pattering on both of them. No questions. No judgments. He stiffened. His knuckles whitened around the ring. Sometimes, Nina said after a moment, you don't need a reason to let someone be kind to you. For a second, nothing changed. Then, slowly, his shoulders sagged. His breath hitched, tremor escaping his chest. Nina hesitated only a moment before reaching out. Her hand touched his shoulder lightly. He didn't pull away. She leaned in, wrapping her arms around him. The tuxedo was wet silk. Under her hands, clinging to his skin. His body was rigid at first, every muscle resisting the contact, like someone who hadn't been touched in a long time. But then he yielded. Leaned into her embrace, letting out a shudder he couldn't hold back. The city faded. The storm became background noise. All that remained was the weight of a broken man in her arms and the quiet strength she offered without knowing why. She whispered, "I'm just here. That's all." For several long minutes, neither spoke. The only sound was rain striking concrete, the occasional honk from the street, and his uneven breathing as it steadied against her shoulder. Strangers. In an alley. Sharing something beyond explanation. When at last she pulled back, he kept his eyes down, ashamed to meet hers. His hand loosened, and the gold ring slipped from his fingers into the puddle between them. Nina bent forward, picked it up, and without asking, slid it gently into the breast pocket of his soaked jacket. A simple act, as if to say, "Don't lose this, even if you don't know what to do with." She stood then, pulling her hood tighter. No words. No names. No promises. She left him there, walked back toward the cafe door, and didn't look back. The rain fell harder as Nina stepped away, her sneakers splashing in shallow puddles. Her hoodie clung to her back, heavy and soaked, but she didn't care. Her mind was still on the man. Slumped against the wall, tuxedo plastered to his body, grief etched into every line of his face. She told herself not to think about him. New York was full of strangers, each carrying their own disasters. She wasn't supposed to carry his. She was just a waitress and he was just a man. Crying in an alley. That should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. Because that ring, that flash of gold she had tucked into his pocket, stayed with her. When she got back inside Camden's, Jules was humming to herself as she wiped down the counter. The cafe smelled like wet coffee grounds and cinnamon from the last batch of scones. Nina pulled off her apron, hung it on the hook by the door, and rubbed her cold arms. "You good?" Jules asked, raising a brow. "Yeah," Nina lied. "Just tired." She didn't mention the man outside. She didn't mention his soaked tux, his shaking hands, or the way he collapsed into her hug like he'd been holding the world alone. That hug hadn't felt like comfort. It had felt like surrender, hers she couldn't tell. She showered it off later, scrubbing her skin until the water ran hot, but the memory stuck. 3 days passed. Nina worked her shifts, paid her bills, and minded her own. Still little details brought him back. The sight of a wet suit in the window of a dry cleaner, the glint of a ring in the jewelry store down the block, the sound of a stranger's muffled sobs in a subway corner. She tried to brush it off. Tried to remind herself that she didn't even know his name. But her chest tightened each time she thought of his face turned away, eyes red and ashamed, as if kindness was foreign to him. That morning, the bell above the cafe door jingled with its usual cheer. The rush hour crowd had thinned, and Nina was pulling espresso shots when Jules came bursting through the door. Phone in hand, voice pitched high with excitement. "You will not believe this," Jules said, slamming her phone down on the counter. Nina arched a brow. "What now?" "Another celebrity breakup." "Better. Page 6. Jules shoved the screen toward her. "Read it." The headline screamed across the page. "Tech mogul ditched at altar. Billionaire tears on Fifth Avenue." The photo was blurry, clearly taken in a rush. A man in a tuxedo, rain dripping off his hair, slumped near a black car. His hand clenched around a small gold band. Nina's stomach dropped. It was him. The man from the alley. The one she hugged. The one she left without asking a single question. Her hand trembled as she held the phone. The text beneath the headline filled in what the photo hadn't. Coulter Langston, CEO of Langston Tech, one of the city's youngest billionaires. supposed to marry socialite Marin Douglas in a lavish ceremony at St. Patrick's. Reporters, the works. But the bride never walked down the aisle. Jules was practically vibrating with glee. That tux. That ring. The drama. Nina forced a laugh. Wild. But her voice cracked. She turned back to the espresso machine, pouring steamed milk with hands that wouldn't steady. Jules didn't notice. Can you imagine being left at the altar with the whole city watching? I'd die. Just die. Nina nodded, but inside, her thoughts spiraled. She had hugged him. She had felt the tremor in his chest. She had tucked that ring into his pocket. She had been there, in the most humiliating moments of his life, before she even knew who he was. And he had no idea who she was. That night, Nina lay in bed staring at the ceiling of her tiny apartment. The pipes above groaned. With the rhythm of someone else's shower. A siren wailed 2 blocks away. She should have been asleep hours ago. She had another shift in the morning. But she couldn't stop thinking, why had he been in that alley and not in a penthouse suite? Somewhere? Why hadn't he had friends or bodyguards around him? Why had he been left alone to fall apart? And most of all, why did she care? She pulled the blanket over her head, squeezed her eyes shut, and told herself to forget. To let the city swallow the memory the way it swallowed everything else. But deep down, she knew this wasn't over. Because kindness like that, raw, unplanned, and unreturned, never really ends where it begins. The next morning, she went to work early. She stood behind the counter wiping down mugs, her movements automatic, her mind still elsewhere. Jules teased her about looking distracted, but Nina brushed it off. Customers came and went, ordering their usual cappuccinos and chai lattes. Nina smiled, right them up, made their drinks. Her body worked like muscle memory. But inside, she was replaying that hug in the rain. And she had no idea that soon, the man she tried to forget would walk right back into her life. Not as a headline, not as a billionaire, but as a customer holding out a scrap of paper with the title of a book. And when he did, the story she thought ended in the alley would be forced to begin again. By the time Nina's shift neared its end that morning, the page 6 headline was still buzzing in her mind like a hornet she couldn't swat. She told herself it didn't matter. Billionaires lived on another planet, far removed from her cramped apartment and overdue rent notices. But the man in that photo wasn't a headline to her. He was a memory, the weight of his soaked tux against her arms, the tremor in his chest, the ring she'd slipped into his pocket. She had touched the story before it ever hit the newsstands. And now it wouldn't leave her alone. "Girl, you're distracted," Jules said, tossing her rag into the sink. "You keep steaming the milk. Too long. That latte nearly boiled." Nina blinked. "Sorry. I'll fix it." "You okay?" Jules pressed, leaning across the counter. "Fine," Nina lied, though her eyes kept flicking to the folded tabloid sitting on the back counter. Jules smirked. "You're not still thinking about that article, are you? The billionaire in the rain? Come on, it's New York. Men cry in alleys all the time." Nina's heart lurched. "You don't think it's sad? Sad? Please." Jules shook her head. "He'll be fine. Guys like that always land on their feet. He's probably already back in some glass tower with another girl on his arm." Nina forced a smile. "Yeah, probably." But the pit in her stomach said otherwise. She had felt the difference that night. That wasn't a man who brushed things off. That was a man split open. The cafe door chimed as a young couple entered, dripping umbrellas in hand. Nina busied herself taking their order, grateful for the distraction. Yet even while she poured their drinks, her thoughts circled back. What was he doing now? Was he eating? Sleeping? Did anyone hug him again after she left? She shook her head. Ridiculous. He didn't need her thoughts. She was nothing more than a stranger who happened to walk outside at the right moment. And yet, when her shift finally ended, Nina stepped into the street with her tote slung over her shoulder. The sky was gray, dampness clinging to the air. Her sneakers splashed through the uneven pavement as she joined the flow of pedestrians. But instead of heading straight home, she found herself glancing down each alley she passed, half expecting to see him there again. She didn't. Of course she didn't. Still, she carried the image with her, the gold ring, the broken tuxedo, the eyes that couldn't meet hers. That evening, she sat in her studio apartment with the lights off, eating takeout noodles from the carton. Her phone buzzed with messages from Jules, gossip about a neighbor's new boyfriend, a meme about spilled lattes. Nina sent back half-hearted replies. The TV flickered in the corner. Another entertainment segment recapped the failed wedding. Photos of the lavish church, the floral arrangements, the designer dress that had never been worn. Commentators speculated about the runaway bride, about Coulter Langston's pride, about how much the fiasco must have cost. Nina muted the volume. She didn't care about the spectacle. All she could think was, he was human before he was a headline. And no one else seemed to notice. The days blurred together. Customers came and went, lattes phoned and served. The tabloid stayed folded behind the counter, Jules pulling it out occasionally to joke about the tragedy of the rich. Nina smiled along, but inside she wanted to snatch the paper away and hide it. Because to her, it wasn't funny. It was a secret. And she held it alone. 3 nights later, the cafe was nearly closed. Chairs were flipped onto tables, the espresso machine scrubbed clean, the last croissant sitting lonely in the display. Nina wiped her hands on a towel, ready to lock up, when the bell over the door jingled. She looked up and froze. It was him. No tuxedo this time. A navy coat draped over his shoulders, black slacks fitted neatly. His dark hair was brushed back, no longer plastered with rain. He looked older in the cafe's warm light. Tired but controlled. Handsome in a way that wasn't about wealth, but about presence. For a second, Nina couldn't breathe. He stepped to the counter, silent, eyes scanning her face. Then he slid a scrap of paper across the wood. Nina glanced down. Scrawled in tidy handwriting were 2 words. The Prophet. She blinked. You're looking for this book? He nodded. Do you have it? Her throat tightened. The cafe doubled as a bookshop. She knew the shelves by heart. Knelt behind the counter, pulling out a copy. When she set it on the wood, his fingers brushed hers as he took it. Steady. And then he spoke, voice low, gravel still lingering in it. You, he said, eyes narrowing. You hugged me. Nina's heart slammed against her ribs. She swallowed hard. Yeah. I did. His gaze lingered, studying her like she was a puzzle piece he'd lost. Why? She lifted her chin. You looked like you needed one. He let out a soft, humorless chuckle. That's not what people usually do. I'm not people. The corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile. He tapped the book once against the counter. Coulter Langston. She nodded slowly. Nina Caldwell. For a moment, they stood in the quiet cafe, the hum of the fridge the only sound. 2 strangers. No longer anonymous. And neither of them knew that this moment, simple, quiet, unremarkable to anyone else, was the beginning of everything that would follow. The next morning, Nina arrived at the cafe earlier than usual. The streets still glistened from the night's rain, sunlight bouncing faintly off puddles in the cracks of the sidewalk. She pushed the key into the lock, opened the door, and was greeted by the familiar smell of roasted beans and old wood. Routine steadied her, grinding beans, prepping pastries, wiping counters. Still her mind wandered back to last night. The moment his fingers brushed hers, the way his gaze lingered, the sound of his voice when he said, "You hugged me." It should have been nothing. A chance meeting. But she felt it under her skin, the weight of something unfinished. By mid-morning, the cafe was buzzing with regulars. Writers hunched over laptops, an elderly couple sharing muffins, students buried in textbooks. Nina moved from customer to customer. With practiced ease, but her thoughts stayed tethered to one question. Would he come back? She told herself not to expect it. Men like Coulter Langston didn't haunt coffee shops in the West Village. They lived in glass towers with city views and staff to fetch their cappuccinos. And yet, when the bell over the door jingled, her chest tightened. He was there. Navy coat again. Black slacks. No entourage, no cameras. Just him, stepping inside with quiet composure. His eyes scanned the room once before landing on her. For a second, she forgot to breathe. Coulter approached the counter. His movements weren't hurried, but they carried the kind of certainty that made space for him without asking. Nina wiped her hands on her apron and forced her voice steady. "Back again?" she asked. He set a small notebook on the counter. "You carry the profit. That's rare these days." "Book and brew," she reminded him. "We've got more than lattes." A faint smile tugged at his lips. He studied her, then glanced at the espresso machine. "What's your best drink?" "Depends who's asking." His brow arched slightly. "What does that mean?" "It means if you like sweet, I'll say a caramella. If you like bitter, I'll say straight espresso. If you're trying to impress someone, I'll say the mocha with extra whip." He chuckled, low and brief. "None of those." "Surprise me." She nodded, turning to the machine. While she worked, she felt his eyes on her. Not in a way that burned, but in a way that searched. Like he was trying to reconcile the girl behind the counter with the stranger who had wrapped him in her arms in an alley. When she slid the cup across to him, he lifted it, sniffed, then took a sip. His expression didn't change, but he nodded. "Not bad." "Not bad," she teased. "That's high praise from a billionaire." His eyes flicked to hers, sharp but not cold. "So you read the article?" Her stomach tightened. Everyone did. He studied her, waiting. Nina straightened her apron. "Look, I don't care about the gossip. You're just a customer here. You don't owe me an explanation." Silence stretched for a beat. Then he said, softer, "Most people want the explanation." "I'm not most people." Something flickered in his gaze, curiosity, maybe even relief. Coulter found a table by the window, pulled out his book, and opened it. Nina tried to return to work, but her eyes kept drifting. He read with focus, occasionally sipping his drink, occasionally jotting notes in the margin. No phone. No laptop. Just pages. It struck her that for all the headlines, for all the speculation about wealth and heartbreak here, he was a man alone with a book, in a cafe that smelled faintly of cinnamon and espresso. When Jules arrived for her shift, she leaned over and whispered, "Holy, is that him?" "Don't start," Nina warned under her breath. "I won't," Jules said, grinning. "But girl, if he's sitting in your cafe, he's not just passing through." Nina ignored her, but deep down, the thought lodged like a seed. Hours passed. The crowd thinned. Eventually, Coulter closed his book, left a few bills under his cup and rose. As he reached the counter on his way out, he paused. "Thank you," he said. "For the drink. For not asking questions." Nina tilted her head. "Not my style." He gave a small nod, then left, the bell above the door chiming as it closed behind him. She stood there, towel in hand, heart beating faster than it should. She told herself it was coincidence. He'd probably never come back. But when the sun dipped below the buildings the next day and the bell chimed again, there he was. And the day after that. Sometimes he ordered espresso. Sometimes tea. Once he asked if she believed in fate. "Not fate," she said, drying mugs. "But timing." His lips quirked in a way that looked like a smile but wasn't quite. Day by day, piece by piece, the stranger from the alley was no longer just a man in a headline. He was Coulter. And against her better judgment, she wanted to know what he'd say next. The cafe had begun to feel different. Not because of new customers or special drinks, but because Coulter kept showing up. Morning or evening, sometimes alone, sometimes slipping in. Just before close. He rarely said much at first, only ordered quietly and lingered with a book. But his presence carried weight, and Nina felt it every time he stepped through the door. On his fourth visit, he waited until the rush thinned before approaching the counter. She was stacking cups when his shadow stretched across the wood. "You hugged me," he said plainly, voice low enough that Jules across the room wouldn't hear. Nina's hand stilled. She looked up, meeting eyes that were sharp but not unkind. We covered that already. He tilted his head slightly. You don't want to ask me why? Why would I? Because people don't do that. She gave a half smile, more tired than playful. I'm not people. Something flickered across his face, a mix of surprise and amusement. That line keeps coming back to you, doesn't it? It's true. She shrugged. I'm not here to collect your secrets. I just reacted. He studied her like she was an equation he couldn't quite solve. Then, with a quiet chuckle, he leaned back. You're the first person who didn't ask me what went wrong. Not once. That's because it's none of my business. It's everyone's business, apparently, he said dryly, nodding toward a tabloid left on an empty table. Nina glanced at it, then back at him. Not mine. He returned to his seat by the window. But instead of pulling out a book, he sat there, staring into his cup. His hands tapped lightly against the saucer, restless. For the first time, he looked less like a man composed and more like someone bracing against questions no one should have to answer. Nina walked over after a while, rag in hand. Refill? He looked up. Do I look like I need one? You look like you need something, she replied, meeting his gaze. He smirked faintly. You're direct. Comes with the job. Customers don't have time for riddles when they want caffeine. This time, he did laugh, a soft sound that didn't quite erase the heaviness in his eyes. The next day he came earlier. Sat at the counter instead of the window. She raised a brow as he slid into the stool. Switching it up? Thought I'd try the front row, he said, glancing at the espresso machine. See how the magic happens. Magic? It's just steamed milk and roasted beans. Depends who's making it, he countered. Nina shook her head but poured his drink anyway. He watched closely, chin propped on his. When she slid the cup toward him, he didn't drink right away. Instead, he asked, So, what's your story? My story? You know mine, thanks to half the tabloids in the city. Seems fair I get to know yours. Nina leaned against the counter, arms crossed. Not much to tell. Grew up in Queens. But working since I was 16. Bills don't pay themselves. That's it. That's all you get for free, she said with a wry grin. Coulter sipped his drink, eyes still fixed on her. You're guarded, says the man who hasn't told me a single thing about himself beyond his name. Touché. He lifted the cup in mock salute. As days bled into each other, their conversations grew. Not dramatic confessions, not long speeches, just fragments exchanged between orders and quiet moments. Books they loved, songs that stuck, childhood memories that crept out unexpectedly. One evening, he asked, Do you ever think about how much of life comes down to timing? Nina paused mid-wipe on the counter. All the time. He nodded, eyes far away. I used to believe everything could be planned, controlled, structured. And now? He glanced at her, his expression unreadable. Now I think I was wrong. Her throat tightened, though she kept her tone even. That's growth. Or regret. Or both. He smiled faintly, then returned to his book. Nina tried to remind herself he was just a customer. A wealthy man passing time in a cafe where she happened to work. But the way he asked questions no one else asked, the way he listened, as if her words carried more weight than she intended, it unsettled her. And yet, she found herself waiting for the bell each day, hoping it would be him. One evening, after closing, she found a napkin folded neatly on the counter where he'd been sitting. She opened it, expecting maybe a note about a book recommendation. Instead, in his careful handwriting, it read, Love isn't supposed to be efficient. But I tried to make it that way. Her hand trembled slightly as she folded it back. She tucked the napkin into her pocket, unsure why she couldn't throw it away. Later that night, lying in bed with the napkin on her nightstand, Nina stared at the ceiling. The words looped in her mind. Efficient. Structured. Controlled. He had tried to manage love the way one manages a company. And it had broken him. She closed her eyes, whispering into the dark, That's not what people do. But the truth was, neither of them seemed interested in doing what people usually did. The napkin stayed in Nina's pocket for 2 days. She told herself she'd toss it, but every time her hand brushed the folded paper, she stopped. Something about the neat handwriting, the raw honesty of the words. Love isn't supposed to be efficient. But I tried to make it that way. Rooted itself in her. By the third morning, she gave up pretending. She left it on her nightstand, beside her alarm. Cluck. She saw it first thing when she woke up and last thing before she went to bed. When Coulter returned to the cafe that evening, she was behind the counter, sleeves rolled up, hair tied back. The place was half full, college kids hunched over laptops, a man in a suit scrolling his phone, 2 friends laughing at a corner table. But when Coulter walked in, Nina felt it. Instantly, like the air itself shifted. He ordered tea this time. No small talk. Just slid the money across the counter and retreated to his usual spot. Nina carried the mug over, setting it in front of him. "You left something," she said quietly. He looked up, brows pulling together. "What?" She pulled the napkin from her apron pocket and set it down. His face tightened. For a moment, he looked almost embarrassed. Then he gave a dry chuckle. "Didn't mean for you to find that." "Then why leave it?" "Habit. I write things down when I can't say them out loud." Nina slid into the chair across from him without asking permission. "So you couldn't say this out loud?" She tapped the napkin. He leaned back, running a hand along his jaw. "It was my flaw. I treated love like an equation. Thought if I chose the right person on paper, everything else would fall in place. I ignored the fact that feelings don't work that way." Nina studied him quiet. He glanced at her. "You think it's foolish. I think it's human." He held her gaze for a long moment. "And what about you? Do you believe in love?" She exhaled slowly. "I believe in moments. Sometimes they build into something bigger. Sometimes they don't. But you can't force them." A silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable but weighted. The bell above the door jingled. A group of customers came in, breaking the moment. Nina stood, smoothing her apron. "Enjoy your tea." But as she walked back to the counter, she felt his eyes on her. The next day, Coulter returned again. This time, the cafe was quiet, the lull between morning and evening rush. He sat at the counter instead of the window, setting his book down but not opening it. "You always read?" Nina asked as she wiped the counter. "It helps me think," he said. "Or stop thinking." "Which one do you need more of?" He smirked. "Depends on the day." She set a cup in front of him. "On the house." He lifted it, sipping slowly. Then, setting it down, he said, "You know, you're different." Nina arched a brow. "That's vague." "I mean it." He leaned in slightly. "Most people either pity me or pry. You do neither." "Maybe I'm just better at pretending." His lips twitched. "You're not. You don't fake things." She tried not to smile, but heat rose in her cheeks. As the days turned into weeks, their exchanges deepened. They spoke of small things, favorite childhood books, songs they listened to when no one else was around, the food they missed when they were sick. But sometimes, without warning, the talk turned heavier. "I built my company because I hated chaos," Coulter admitted one night. "Every part of my life was structured. I thought if I had enough control, nothing could break me." "And then?" Nina prompted. "And then the one thing I couldn't control broke me anyway." Nina said nothing, letting the words hang. Sometimes silence was kinder than advice. One evening, as she closed the register, she found him waiting by the door. "Walk with me," he. She hesitated. She didn't usually blur lines with customers. But Coulter wasn't just a customer anymore. They walked through the damp streets, the glow of street lamps reflecting off slick pavement. Neither spoke for several blocks. Finally, he broke the silence. "You hugged me that night without knowing who I was. Why?" She glanced at him. "Because you needed it. That's all." He nodded slowly. "That moment, it's the only thing that kept me from collapsing completely." She swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. He stopped walking, turning to her. You hugged me like you already knew me. Her chest tightened. Maybe I did. For the first time, his expression softened fully, no walls, no composure. Just a man stripped of everything but honesty. And for Nina, it was enough. That night, when she crawled into bed, she unfolded the napkin again. She whispered the words out loud, as if testing them against her own truth. Love isn't supposed to be efficient. And for the first time in years, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, she was ready to find out what it was supposed to be. It had been nearly 2 weeks since the alley. 2 weeks since the tuxedoed stranger became Coulter Langston, the billionaire who now sat almost daily in Nina's cafe. Their conversations had shifted from cautious to curious, from guarded to genuine. Still, Nina kept a line drawn in her mind. Customer and waitress, nothing more. At least she tried. One Thursday evening, just before closing, Coulter lingered near the counter long after his cup was empty. Nina wiped down tables, pretending not to notice his hesitation. Finally, he cleared his throat. Have dinner with me, he said. The rags stilled in her hand. She turned, eyebrows lifting. That was direct. I don't believe in wasting time. She leaned against the counter. You've been left at the altar, in case you forgot. Don't you think jumping to dinner dates is reckless? His mouth quirked. Or maybe just honest. She shook her head. I'm not sure it's a good idea. He held her gaze. Why not? Because I don't know you. You know enough. More than most people who've known me for years. That silenced her for a beat. She swallowed, trying to mask the flutter in her chest. I'll think about it, she said finally. Fair enough, he replied. Then he left, the bell chiming faintly in his wake. For the next few days, she tried to avoid the question hanging between them. She buried herself in work, pretended the napkin on her nightstand didn't exist, told herself he would move on if she stayed quiet. But Coulter was nothing if not persistent. The following Monday, he showed up right before closing again. This time, he didn't order. Just leaned against the counter, arms crossed. So, he said, have you decided? Nina sighed, crossing her arms to mirror him. You don't quit, do you? Not when it matters. And how do you know this matters? He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. Because timing doesn't always give second chances. Her pulse skipped. She looked away, shaking her head. You really know how to put pressure on a girl. I'm not pressuring you. I'm telling you the truth. The room fell quiet. The espresso machine clicked softly as it cooled. Outside, the rain tapped against the glass. Finally, Nina exhaled. Fine. One dinner. Coulter's lips curved into the faintest smile. That's all I asked. On Friday night, Nina stood in front of her closet, staring at clothes that felt suddenly inadequate. Her wardrobe consisted mostly of jeans, work shirts, and the occasional sundress. Nothing screamed dinner with a billionaire. She settled on a black dress, simple but fitted, with a jacket to soften it. As she fastened her earrings, she muttered under her breath, It's just dinner. That's all. But her reflection in the mirror gave her away. She cared. Coulter's driver dropped her at a high-rise overlooking the Hudson. The building's glass exterior shimmered with reflections of city lights. The doorman greeted her by name, clearly briefed, and escorted her to the private elevator. By the time she reached the penthouse, her nerves buzzed. The doors slid open to reveal Coulter waiting in a navy suit, no tie, sleeves rolled back casually. You clean up well, she said before she could stop herself. He smirked. You're not so bad yourself. His penthouse wasn't what she expected. No gold chandeliers or gaudy displays. Instead, clean lines, soft lighting, leather furniture, and art pieces that felt chosen, not flaunted. Floor to ceiling. Windows framed the river, the skyline glowing in the distance. It's beautiful, she admitted, stepping toward the glass. It's quiet, he corrected. Quiet can be beautiful. He joined her at the window, holding 2 glasses of wine. Red or white? She eyed the glass in his right hand. Red. Good choice. He handed it over. They sat on the couch, the storm rolling over the city outside. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It pulsed with unspoken questions, unvoiced truths. Nina swirled her wine. So, is this where you impress women? He chuckled. If I wanted to impress you, I'd have chosen a restaurant with white tablecloths and overpriced menus. And why didn't you? Because I don't want to impress you. I want to know you. Her breath caught. She masked it with another sip of wine. Minutes stretched, the storm deepening outside. Finally, she set her glass down, turning toward him. You never talk about her. His jaw tightened. He swirled his wine, staring at the red liquid. Because there's nothing worth saying. I didn't love her the way a man should love his bride. I loved the idea of her. The order. The structure. And me? Nina asked, voice barely above a whisper. He looked at her then, eyes steady, voice even. You hugged me like you already knew me. Something shifted in the air. Heavy, electric. Nina's chest rose and fell, heart racing. And what if I want to know you? Then come here, he said quietly. She moved before she thought, setting her glass aside and closing the space between them. Their kiss began slow, tentative, like a question. His hand rose to her waist, unsure at first, then firmer as she leaned into him. The world outside blurred, the storm, the skyline, the hum of the city. All that remained was two people, broken in different ways, finding something they hadn't expected. Their kiss broke gently, not from hesitation but from the need to breathe. Nina sat back slightly, her hands still on Coulter's chest. She could feel his heartbeat under her palm, strong but uneven, like a man caught between restraint and desire. You're not what I expected, he said softly. Good, she replied, her lips curving. Expectations are boring. He laughed under his breath, the sound almost surprised. You're right. They are. The storm outside deepened, rain streaking the windows in silver threads. Coulter stood, moving, to the shelves near the wall. He picked up a leather-bound book, turning it in his hands. I've spent most of my life trying to make sense of things, he said. Everything had to follow a pattern. Business, relationships, even love. If I couldn't chart it, plan it, manage it, then I convinced myself it wasn't worth my time. And how did that work out? Nina asked gently. He gave a humorless smile. I ended up standing in the rain with a ring I couldn't give back. Nina's eyes softened. Maybe love isn't meant to be managed. He turned, leaning against the shelf. That's the part one never understood. How do you build a life? On something you can't measure. She shrugged lightly. You don't measure it. You feel it. You live it. He tilted his head, studying her. You make it sound easy. It's not, she admitted. It's messy, it's painful, it's unpredictable. But it's real. He set the book back on the shelf and returned to the couch. Sitting closer this time, he leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. The woman I was supposed to marry, she was perfect. On paper. Her family background, her education, the way she looked standing beside me in photos. She fit the image. The structure. I thought if I aligned the right pieces, happiness would follow. But happiness isn't a business deal, Nina said quietly. No, he looked down at his hands. It isn't. There was a silence, filled only by the hum of the storm. Nina reached for her wine again, sipping slowly, watching him from the corner of her eye. He looked smaller somehow, not in stature but in spirit, as though confessing the truth had stripped him of the armor he usually carried. Coulter, she said finally, what do you want now? He lifted his gaze to hers. I want to stop pretending. Her breath caught. Pretending what? That I know what love should look like. That I can design it, structure it, force it to make sense. Don't want that anymore. And what do you want instead? She pressed. He hesitated, then spoke with quiet certainty. I want something that feels alive. Something that doesn't need a blueprint. Something like this. His eyes lingered on her, unguarded. Nina's chest tightened. Careful, she whispered, half teasing. That almost sounded romantic. Maybe it is. They sat in silence again, but it wasn't empty. The storm outside became background, their focus anchored only to each other. Finally, Nina set her glass down and leaned back against the cushions. You know, you don't have to figure it out tonight. Coulter turned slightly toward her. What if I don't have another night? She gave him a steady look. You will. But if you're serious, then show me. Not with words. With how you live. With how you treat people. With how you treat me. His jaw tightened, but not in resistance. More like a man absorbing a challenge he intended to. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight. Nina realized she'd stayed longer than she intended. She rose, smoothing her dress. I should go. Coulter stood as well. Let me have my driver take you home. She shook her head. No need. The subway will do. Nina. Don't, she cut him off gently. If you want to prove something, don't start by wrapping me in luxury. Start by listening. By being real. He paused, then nodded slowly. Fair enough. At the door, she hesitated. Thank you for dinner. He met her eyes. Thank you for saying yes. The elevator ride down felt longer than usual. As she stepped out into the lobby, the doorman offered her a polite nod, but she barely noticed. Her thoughts were tangled. She had come into the evening braced for pretense, for surface-level charm. Instead, she had seen a man trying, failing, and finally admitting he didn't have the answers. And somehow, that mattered more than any skyline view. That night, in her apartment, Nina pulled the napkin from her nightstand again. She read the line. For what felt like the 100th time, love isn't supposed to be efficient. She placed it back carefully, whispering into the quiet, maybe you're starting to learn. For the first time in a long while, she drifted to sleep with the sense that something new, fragile, uncertain, but real, had begun. The following evening, Nina tried to talk herself out of it. She reminded herself of the risks, the imbalance between their worlds, the way his name lived in headlines while hers lived on it. Timecard. Yet when Coulter called, voice steady but tinged with hope, she found herself saying. By the time she arrived at his penthouse again, the storm had passed. The city glittered beyond. The tall windows, the Hudson gleaming like polished steel under the moonlight. Coulter greeted her at the door in a simple gray sweater, no jacket, no armor. You came, he said softly. You asked, she replied, stepping inside. Dinner was lighter this time. Takeout containers spread across the coffee table, noodles, dumplings, spring rolls. Nina laughed as she opened a carton. So much for fine dining. I wanted normal, he said. I figured you'd appreciate that. I do. She smiled, settling onto the couch. But just so you know, I have a soft spot for cheap Chinese food. Good, he said, sitting beside her. Then we're both in the right place. They ate, talked about nothing. Favorite movies, awkward childhood stories, books that shaped them. For once, there were no heavy confessions, no shadows hovering. Just two people sharing food and space. When the cartons were empty, Nina leaned back against the cushions, sipping from her water. You know, she said lightly, you're not what I thought a billionaire would be. And what's that? Arrogant. Detached. Surrounded by yes-men. He chuckled. I can be detached. And I definitely have more yes-men than I want. But arrogant? He shook his head. Not tonight. She studied him, her voice softening. Not tonight. Silence stretched. Not awkward. Not forced. Just charged. Nina set her glass on the table, turning slightly toward him. You never answered my question. The other night. What question? Me. Her eyes held his. What do you see when you look at me? Coulter's expression shifted. He set his glass down carefully, then leaned closer. I see the woman who sat in the rain beside me when no one else would. The woman who didn't need my name, my story, or my excuses to offer kindness. I see the person who hugged me like I wasn't broken. Her breath caught. Heat bloomed in her chest. And now, she whispered. His voice dropped. Now I see someone I want to know. Not because of timing, not just because of choice. The air between them tightened. Nina swallowed, her voice barely audible. Then say it. His gaze didn't waver. Come here. She moved without hesitation. Their lips met again, firmer this time, no uncertainty, only pull. Hands found her waist, her fingers curling into the fabric of his sweater. The kiss deepened, searching, urgent. She climbed onto his lap, their bodies aligning instinctively. His breath hitched as her fingers trailed along his jaw, down his neck. He drew her closer, like letting her go would mean losing. More than he could bear. The city lights poured across them, painting their skin in silver and shadow. He pulled back briefly, forehead resting against hers. I don't want this to be fleeting, he murmured. It doesn't have to be, she replied, brushing her lips against his again. He kissed her with renewed hunger, hands exploring, but still with reverence. Every movement was deliberate, as though he were memorizing her. Nina responded with equal fire, tugging at his sweater until he lifted it over his head. She ran her palms across his chest, feeling the steady rhythm beneath his skin. He lifted her gently, carrying her toward the bedroom. His lips never left her skin, tracing along her jaw, her neck, her collarbone. Each kiss felt like a promise, unspoken but undeniable. In the quiet of his room, they slowed. Clothes fell away, but there was no rush, no frenzy. Instead, there was intention, a steady unraveling of walls, a steady surrender to something neither had planned. He touched her like she was fragile and fierce all at once, like every part of her deserved to be honored. She responded with equal intensity, showing him that he didn't have to perform, didn't have to impress. He just had to be. When he finally entered her, it wasn't conquest. It was connection. Their movements found rhythm, not forced, not hurried, but real. Nina clutched his shoulders, gasping his name. Colt shuddered, holding her tighter, as if anchoring himself in the moment. Their cries mingled with the muffled hum of the city outside, and when release came, it was more than physical. It was surrender, relief, discovery. Afterward, they lay tangled in the sheets, her head on his shoulder, his hand stroking lazy circles along her back. The silence was thick but gentle. Stay, he whispered, voice rough. She didn't answer with words. She only pressed closer, closing her eyes, letting his warmth ground her. For the first time in years, Nina didn't feel like she had to be anywhere else. The invitation had arrived in a crisp white envelope sealed with a silver crest. Coulter handed it to Nina one afternoon at the cafe, sliding it across the counter without ceremony. What's this? She asked, wiping foam from her fingers before opening it. A gala, he said. Charity event. My company sponsors it every year. Nina unfolded the heavy cardstock, eyes skimming the elegant lettering. Langston Foundation. Annual benefit. Black tie. Waldorf ballroom. Cameras guaranteed. Her brow arched. And you want me to go with you? Coulter leaned casually against the counter. I do. She hesitated, scanning his face for a hint of pressure. Instead, she saw only calm certainty. Why? She asked. Because I want you there. And because I'm tired of showing up with people who don't matter. Nina looked down at the card, her pulse quickening. A gala wasn't her world. She didn't own gowns, didn't glide through ballrooms with practiced grace. But the way he said it, steady, unyielding, made it hard to say no. All right, she said at last. But don't expect me to blend in. His lips curved faintly. I don't want you to blend in. The night of the gala, Nina stood before her mirror, smoothing the black silk dress sheet, borrowed from Jules. It hugged her frame simply, no sequins, no dramatic slit, understated, but it fit her like it belonged. She paired it with small diamond studs, the only jewelry she owned. Of value, a gift from her grandmother. You look like trouble, Jules teased as she zipped the back. More like I look like I don't belong, Nina muttered. Please, Jules scoffed. You're going to walk in there and every head will turn. Just don't forget. Who you are? I couldn't if I tried, Nina said softly. Coulter's driver collected her just after 7. When she stepped out of the car at the Waldorf, flashes from cameras lit the entrance as sleek vehicles pulled up one after another. Tuxedos, women in glittering gowns, all smiles polished for the press. Coulter waited near the entrance, tall in his tailored tux, bow tie sharp. When his eyes found her, something softened in his expression. He extended his hand, steady and sure. You look, he paused, searching for the right word. Like trouble? She teased, echoing Jules. Like you're exactly where you're supposed to be, he said simply. Her cheeks warmed as she placed her hand in his. Inside, the ballroom was awash in gold and crystal. Chandeliers glimmered above, violins played softly in the corner, and waiters in white jackets weaved through the crowd with trays of food. Coulter guided her through the throng with an ease that spoke of years of practice. People turned to greet him, offering handshakes, smiles, quick remarks. But his attention never strayed far from her. His hand rested at the small of her back, steady, grounding. Nina, for her part, felt the weight of eyes. Some curious, some assessing, some outright skeptical. Whispers floated behind manicured hands as she passed. She kept her chin high, refusing to shrink. At the bar, Coulter leaned close. Ignore them. I am, she said, though her chest tightened. You're with me. That's enough. They mingled, sipping champagne, talking quietly between introductions. A few bold guests tried to draw Nina into conversation, asking where she was from, what she did. Some answered plainly, Queens, Waitress, Cafe on West 10th. The bluntness disarmed some, unsettled others. Coulter only smiled, as if each honest word made her presence stronger. As the evening stretched, the orchestra shifted into a livelier piece, and couples drifted onto the dance floor. Coulter turned to her, offering his hand. Dance with me. Nina laughed nervously. I'm not sure I remember how. Then let me remind you. He led her onto the floor, guiding her with quiet confidence. His hand at her waist, hers resting in they found a rhythm. She relaxed into the movement, surprised at how natural it felt. You're staring, she murmured as his gaze lingered. I can't help it. Her lips curved. Flattery suits you. It's not flattery. It's fact. For a moment, Nina forgot the eyes, the whispers, the wealth surrounding them. It was just the two of them, spinning gently under the chandeliers, the music carrying them. But then she felt it. A shift. A chill slicing through the warmth. Across the ballroom, a woman had entered. Tall, blonde, striking in a silver gown. Her heels clicked sharply against the marble as she moved, each step deliberate, eyes locked on Coulter. Nina felt his body stiffen beneath her touch. His hand, steady all evening, faltered just slightly at her waist. Who is she? Nina asked quietly. Coulter's jaw tightened. Marin. The name landed heavy. The bride who never walked down the aisle. Nina's pulse quickened. She stepped back slightly, but Coulter held firm. Keep dancing, he murmured. Coulter. Not here. Not now. But it was too late. The past had arrived in heels and silver silk, and it was walking straight toward them. The music swelled around them, violins climbing, couples laughing as they twirled. But for Nina, the ballroom dimmed. Her focus locked on the woman gliding closer, Marin Douglas. Her silver gown shimmered under the chandeliers, each step punctuated with the confidence of someone who had owned every room she entered. Nina's hand tightened in Coulter's. She's coming this way, she whispered. I see her, he murmured, his tone flat but taut. Do you want to leave? No, his grip firmed at her waist. I won't run from her. Marin reached them within seconds, her perfume crisp and cutting through the champagne air. She smiled, not warm, not soft, but polished. Coulter, she said smoothly. May I have a word? Nina felt his body stiffen beside her. For a moment he didn't answer. Then he nodded once. So, Marin. Her gaze flicked briefly to Nina, eyes narrowing in quick assessment, before returning to Coulter. "It's important." Nina stepped back, her chest tight. "It's fine," she said quietly. "Go." Coulter hesitated, his jaw flexing, then released her hand gently. "I'll be right back." They moved a few paces away, toward the edge of the dance floor where the shadows of tall drapes offered a sliver of privacy. Still, from where she stood, Nina could see them. Marin leaned in close, her hand brushing Coulter's sleeve, sliding deliberately to his arm. It wasn't affectionate, it was possession or maybe performance. Either way, it made Nina's stomach churn. Coulter didn't recoil. He didn't pull back. He froze. His eyes narrowed slightly, lips pressed thin. But his body stayed rooted. Nina's pulse hammered. She couldn't hear the words, but she could read the body language. Marin tilted her head, lips moving quickly, urgently. Her hand lingered, nails grazing his cuff. Coulter's shoulders tensed, but he remained still. That pause, that fraction of a second where he didn't move, seared into Nina. Jules' voice echoed in her head, "Don't forget who you are." And who was she? A waitress in borrowed silk, standing in a ballroom where she didn't belong, watching a man she was just beginning to trust hesitate under the touch of the woman who had left him humiliated before the entire city. Heat rose in her chest, sharp and painful. She swallowed hard, forcing her face into composure. Around her, laughter bubbled, glasses clinked, music soared. No one else noticed the tiny storm unraveling in the corner. Nina did. And it was enough. Coulter finally lifted Marin's hand from his arm, setting it aside gently but firmly. His lips moved. Words Nina couldn't hear but saw in the finality of his expression. Marin's face flickered with frustration before she smoothed it into practiced elegance. But by then, Nina had already made her choice. She set her empty glass on a passing tray, squared her shoulders, and walked out of the ballroom without a word. The city air hit her like a slap. Cool, sharp, filled with the echo of horns and distant traffic. Her heels clicked against the marble steps as she descended quickly, clutching her jacket around her shoulders. She flagged a cab, slid inside, and shut the door before the driver could even ask where. "West Village," she said, voice tight. The car pulled away from the glittering lights of the Waldorf. Nina pressed her forehead to the glass, watching the skyline blur. Her mind replayed it in ruthless detail. Marin's hand, Coulter's pause, the silence that said too. Maybe he didn't want Marin back. Maybe he had no feelings left for her. But that pause, hesitation, felt like betrayal all the same. Because when someone touches you like they still have a claim, you either move or you don't. And Coulter hadn't. Back in her apartment, Nina slipped out of the black silk dress and hung it carefully, her hands shaking. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her reflection in the darkened window. She whispered to herself, "You knew better." Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, a text from Jules asking how the gala went. Nina turned it face down without replying. She lay back on the bed, clutching her pillow, the image of Coulter frozen under Marin's touch burned into her mind. And with that, the fragile hope she had been nursing cracked. The cab rattled over potholes, headlights streaking across wet pavement. Nina sat rigid in the back seat, arms folded tight, fighting the sting at the corners of her eyes. She had promised herself not to cry, not over him, not over this. But the image replayed with cruel clarity. Marin's manicured hand sliding onto his arm, and Coulter's stillness. That pause said more than words ever could. Back in her apartment, Nina tossed her heels aside and dropped onto the couch. The black silk dress clung to her skin, reminding her of the ballroom, the stairs, the whispered questions she had tried to ignore. She pulled a blanket around herself and sat in the dim glow of her lamp, waiting, though for what, she didn't know. Her phone lay face up on the coffee table. No calls, no messages, no explanations. She told herself she didn't want one. She told herself she was better off without the drama of billionaires and socialites. But the ache in her chest betrayed her. The next morning at Camden's, Jules noticed instantly. You look wrecked, she said, sliding a tray of croissants into the display. Thanks for the pep talk, Nina muttered, tying her apron. What happened last night? Did he trip over a champagne fountain? Did you trip over him? Jules grinned at her own joke, then frowned when Nina didn't respond. Spill. Nina shook her head, focusing on steaming milk. It doesn't matter. It matters if you look like somebody stole your cat. Nina exhaled sharply. She was there. Who? The bride who never showed up. Jules froze. No way. And she touched him. He froze. I left. Jules blinked, setting the tongs down. Okay, but did he do anything? That's the problem, Nina whispered. He didn't. The day dragged. Customers flowed in and out, lattes foamed, dishes clattered. Nina smiled. Mechanically, her body moving through routine while her mind replayed the ballroom. Every time. The bell over the door jingled, her chest clenched, half expecting Coulter to walk in. He didn't. Not that day. Not the next. 3 days passed. No texts. No visits. No notes on napkins. Nina told herself she didn't care, but her heart refused to obey. She carried his absence like an invisible weight, heavy in the quiet moments. On the 4th night, she sat at her kitchen table, the napkin unfolded before her. The words stared back at her. Love isn't supposed to be efficient. But I tried to make it that way. She traced the letters with her fingertip. And now you're trying nothing at all, she murmured. By the weekend, even Jules had gone quiet on the subject. She watched Nina move through. Her shifts with a clipped edge, not pushing for details, only slipping her extra muffins or covering. When Nina needed a moment in the back room. You'll figure it out, Jules said finally, late one night as they locked up. But don't waste yourself waiting. If he wants you, he knows where to find you. Nina forced a small smile. Yeah. But in her heart, doubt gnawed. On Sunday morning, rain returned, pattering against the cafe windows. Nina stood behind the counter, arms folded, watching droplets race each other down the glass. The city bustled. Outside, umbrellas bobbing, taxis honking, life moving on as if her world hadn't paused. She thought of Coulter in his penthouse, overlooking the Hudson, surrounded by silence. Did he think of her? Did he regret the pause that had broken her trust? Or had he already slipped back into the orbit of polished women like Marin, where she had never belonged? The questions burned, but the answers didn't come. And for now, there were no calls. No words. Only absence. That night, in bed, Nina finally let the tears come. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet streams. That soaked her pillow as she whispered to herself, "You knew better." But knowing better didn't make it hurt less. The storm rolled in without warning, the kind of downpour that turned sidewalks into rivers and left umbrellas snapping in the wind. Nina stood at her apartment window, arms crossed, watching sheets of rain blur the city lights. It had been over a week since the gala. Over a week of silence. Over a week of no calls, no visits, no words. She told herself she was done waiting. She had replayed the moment enough times to know it was final. But still, some fragile part of her, stubborn, aching, hadn't let go. So when the knock came at her door, sharp and insistent, she thought at first she'd imagined it. Another knock. Louder. Her chest tightened. She crossed the small living room, hesitated, then opened the door. Coulter stood there, drenched. His hair plastered to his forehead, water dripping from his coat. His shoulders heaving like he'd run the whole way. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. Rain roared behind him, wind pushing droplets into the hallway. Finally, Nina broke the silence. "What are you doing here?" "I had to see you," he said, voice rough. Her grip on the door tightened. "Now? After all this time?" He took a shaky breath. "I should have come sooner. But I..." She cut him off, her voice sharper than she intended. "But you didn't." He flinched, the water trailing down his face mixing with the hurt in his eyes. Nina stepped back just enough for him to enter. He hesitated, then crossed the threshold, dripping onto her worn rug. She shut the door firmly behind him. They stood in the small space, Rain hammering the windows, silence pressing in. Coulter finally. She wanted to come back, he said. Marin. That night. Nina's chest tightened. And? I told her no. Her eyes searched his face. Then why did you pause when she touched you? The question hung heavy, years of her own insecurities wrapped into it. Coulter ran a hand through his soaked hair, pacing once before stopping in front of her. Because. I was stunned, Nina. I didn't expect her to show up. I didn't expect her to touch me. But stunned. Isn't tempted. Don't punish me for freezing. She folded her arms across her chest. You think I imagined it? No, his voice softened. I think you felt something real. But it wasn't what you thought. That it was shocked. Not want. Nina turned away, walking toward the window. Lightning flashed across the skyline, illuminating. Her reflection in the glass, hair tousled, eyes brimming with anger she didn't want to admit. Was fear. You could have come after me, she whispered. You let me leave. You let days pass. Coulter's footsteps approached slowly. Because I thought I'd lost my chance. I thought you'd already decided what I was. And what are you? She asked bitterly. He stopped behind her, his voice steady. A man who made mistakes. But not the ones you think. She turned then, meeting his gaze. His face was raw, stripped of composure. No tuxedo, no. Polished calm. Just Coulter, soaked, desperate, standing in her apartment like everything depended on this moment. Why should I believe you? She asked, her voice trembling despite her effort to keep it firm. Because I'm here, he said simply. In the rain at your door, telling you the truth. Not because. It's convenient. Because it's all I have left to give. The silence stretched. Nina's heart raced, torn between the ache of betrayal and the pull of the man standing before her. You paused, she said again, softer this time. I know, he admitted. But I won't pause now. Not for her. Not for anyone. Only for you. Tell me to stop. Her throat tightened. She wanted to stay angry, wanted to hold on to the safety of her distance. But the honesty in his voice chipped at the walls she had built. And for the first time since the gala, she let herself feel the truth. She wasn't done with him. Coulter stood in the middle of Nina's small apartment, water dripping onto the rug, his chest rising. And falling like he'd run through the storm just to reach her. His words still lingered in the air. Only for you, if you tell me to stop. Nina crossed her arms tighter. She wanted to stay unmoved, to cling to her anger as armor. But the earnestness in his eyes chipped away at her resolve. You don't get to walk in here and fix this with a few words, she said finally. I'm not trying to fix it with words, Coulter replied, his voice low, steady. I'm trying to fix it by showing up. That's all I can do. The rain thundered against the glass, filling the silence that followed. Coulter took a step closer, careful, deliberate. That night, he said, when she touched me, I froze. Because for 1 second I was back at the altar, back in that moment when she didn't show. It stunned me. But that's all it was. Nina's jaw clenched. You paused. That's what I saw. Yes, he admitted without hesitation. I paused. But don't punish me for blinking. Don't turn 1 second of shock into a story about who I am. Her throat tightened. His words rang with a truth she didn't want to acknowledge. She turned toward the window, staring at the blur of city lights through the rain. Do you know how it felt? Standing there, in that ballroom, in borrowed silk, surrounded by people who were already questioning why I was even there, and then seeing her touch you like she still had it. Claim. Coulter's voice softened. And do you know how it felt, seeing you walk away while I was still trying to find words to end it with her? Nina spun around, eyes flashing. You should have moved the second she reached for you. His own voice rose, not in anger but desperation. You're right. I should have. But I didn't. And I can't change that moment. All I can do is stand here now and tell you it meant nothing. It means nothing. The fight drained from her shoulders, leaving only exhaustion. She sat on the edge of the couch, burying her face in her hands. I don't know if I can trust that. Coulter crouched in front of her, his soaked clothes clinging, his hair dripping onto the floor. It didn't reach for her, didn't touch. He just looked up at her with unguarded eyes. Then trust this, he said quietly. I came here. In the rain. No entourage, no driver, no shield. Just me. Because losing you scared me more than any headline, any scandal, any empire I've built. Her fingers lowered slowly, revealing eyes glassy with unshed tears. Do you know what I was afraid of? Nina whispered. What? That you wouldn't come. That I mattered for a moment in an alley, but not in your life. His jaw tightened. You matter more than you realize. That hug, it changed everything. It broke through something I thought was unbreakable. And I've been terrified ever since because I don't know how to do this without ruining it. Nina searched his face. His confession was raw, unpolished, stripped of the careful logic he usually carried. She shook her head slightly. You can't just say things like that and expect me to. I'm not expecting anything, he cut in. I'm asking you to let me try. Asking you to give me the chance to show you that my pause doesn't define me. The room stilled. The rain softened to a steady rhythm outside, less a storm now and more a lullaby. Nina's shoulders slumped. She wanted to resist, wanted to protect herself. But the man kneeling in front of her wasn't the composed billionaire from the tabloids. He was the broken stranger from the alley, the one who had clutched a ring like it was the last piece of himself. And she remembered what she had said that night. Sometimes, you don't need a reason to let someone be kind to you. Maybe now, it was his turn to ask for kindness. She exhaled shakily. Coulter. He leaned forward slightly, searching her eyes. Say the word and I'll leave. But if you don't, I'll stay. And I'll prove this isn't just a moment. It's real. Her heart pounded. She wanted to tell him to leave, to make the choice simple. But the truth was written in the ache of her chest. She didn't want him gone. Slowly she reached out, her hand brushing against his. His eyes closed briefly, relief flashing across his face. Stay, she whispered. Coulter rose, pulling her gently into his arms. She didn't resist. She leaned into him, feeling the damp chill of his coat give way to the warmth of his body beneath. For the first time since the gala, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end. The moment stretched, quiet but charged. Coulter's arms around her felt different now, desperate like the alley, not polished like the gala. This embrace carried rawness, apology, and something unspoken that pressed against her heart. Nina didn't resist. She let herself lean into him, her cheek against his chest, listening to the uneven rhythm of his breath. For a long while, neither spoke. The rain softened against the window, fading from storm to steady whisper. Finally, she pulled back just enough to meet his eyes. You can't just show up like this every time you're scared. I didn't come because I was scared, Coulter said, voice low. I came because I couldn't stay away any longer. Her lips parted, but she didn't argue. He brushed damp curls from her cheek, his fingers lingering. That hug in the alley, it wasn't just kindness. It was recognition. You saw me when I couldn't see myself. Coulter, she began, but he shook his head gently. Let me finish. I've spent years building walls, keeping everything controlled. But when you touched me that night, the walls cracked. And when you left me at that ballroom, I realized I couldn't bear losing you too. Her throat tightened. She searched his face, looking for pretense, for performance. There was none. Then prove it, she whispered. Not with words. With how you love. The air between them shifted. He leaned down, kissing her softly at first, tentative as though asking permission. She answered with a hand at the back of his neck, pulling him closer. The kiss deepened, slow but certain, each movement deliberate, careful, reverent. Clothes fell away not in urgency but in patience. His hands moved across her skin like memorization, not conquest. Every brush of his lips along her collarbone, every press of his Fingers at her waist carried intention, not lust alone, but devotion building from fracture. Nina gasped softly, her body arching toward him. Coulter paused, resting his forehead against hers. "Tell me to stop and I will." She shook her head, her voice husky. "Don't stop." They moved together in unison, guided by need but framed in tenderness. When he entered her, it wasn't the rush of hunger they'd shared before. It was slower, deeper, every motion like an oath. Nina clutched at him, her breath catching with each thrust, the world beyond her apartment falling away. Her name slipped from his lips like a prayer, and when she cried out his, he buried his face in her neck, shuddering. When release finally came, it wasn't frantic, it was profound. A letting go, a claiming discovery. Afterward, they lay tangled in sheets, their bodies slick with warmth, their breaths slowly returning to rhythm. Coulter traced light circles along her shoulder, his voice barely above a whisper. "This feels different," he said. Nina shifted to face him, her palm resting against his chest. "Because it is." He studied her, eyes softer than she'd ever seen them. "I've been with people before. But never like this. Never where it felt sacred." Her heart clenched at the word. She reached for his hand, lacing her fingers with his. "Maybe that's because you finally stopped trying to control it." He kissed her knuckles. "Maybe it's because of you." They fell into silence again, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was peaceful. The storm outside had passed, leaving only the hum of the city and the quiet promise of something new taking root. Nina closed her eyes, letting the weight of him beside her soothe the ache she had carried since the gala. For the first time in days, she believed they had a chance. Fragile, imperfect, but real. In the early hours, Coulter stirred, brushing her hair back. "Stay," he whispered again though. Sleep had already pulled her under. And she did. 6 months later, the city moved through its usual rhythm, taxis honking, street vendors calling out, tourists snapping photos on sidewalks. But on the corner of 14th Street, something new had risen, a glass front building, warm light spilling from inside, the name the Caldwell Center, etched into the stone above its doors. Inside, shelves stretched from wall to wall, stacked with books free for anyone to take. They smelled of roasted beans and fresh pages. In one corner, baristas poured coffee for neighbors who couldn't pay, no questions asked. Across the room, a mural of bright colors spread across the wall, painted by local artists who had been given a space to create without cost. And in the middle of it all, moving with practiced ease, was Nina. She carried a tray of mugs back to the counter, her black apron smudged with flour. But unlike the cafe in the West Village, this place felt different. Larger, fuller, alive. She greeted people by name, laughed with kids who sprawled on the beanbags in the reading nook, and guided volunteers setting up an evening poetry circle. To everyone else, she was the manager of the Caldwell Center, the woman who made sure everything ran with heart. But she knew the truth. This building was Coulter's gift, his promise, his way of saying he had listened when she told him love wasn't about control, but about presence. And he hadn't just listened. He had built it. Coulter appeared at the doorway, dressed simply in a navy shirt and slacks, no entourage trailing. His eyes scanned the room until they landed on her. A faint smile tugged at his lips as he crossed the floor. "You're working too hard," he said when he reached her. "I always work too hard," Nina shot back with a grin. "Besides, it's worth it." He leaned against the counter, watching as she wiped down a stack of mugs. "You've turned this into more than I imagined." "You gave the space," she corrected. "The people made it what it is." He tilted his head. "And who made the people feel like they belonged?" Nina tried to deflect with a shrug, but his gaze held hers, steady and sure. She felt the warmth rise in her chest, the same warmth that had carried them from the alley, to the penthouse, to this moment. A small boy tugged at her sleeve. "Miss Nina, can we read now?" She smiled, bending down to his level. "Of course. Pick your favorite and bring it over." The boy scampered off, clutching a worn copy of Charlotte's Web. Nina straightened, catching Coulter watching her, his expression softer than she'd ever seen. "What?" she asked. He shook his head. "Nothing. Just, this is exactly what I hoped for." Later that evening, as the last of the kids left with parents and the lights dimmed to a gentle glow, Nina stood at the front desk, checking the day's notes. Coulter joined her, sliding a hand over hers on the counter. "Do you realize what you've built here?" he asked. She looked around, at the shelves, the mural, the empty mugs waiting to be washed. "Built it." He squeezed her hand lightly. "No, Nina. You did. You turned a building into a place where people can be held, the way you held me that night." Her breath caught. 6 months later, and he still carried that night in the alley like a compass, pointing him back to her. Outside, rain began again, soft against the glass. Nina glanced toward the door. Memories? Rushing back, a tuxedo, a gold ring, a broken man. She never could have guessed it would lead here, to a space filled with life, with hope, with second chances. She turned back to Coulter, her voice steady but tender. "You know what this really is?" "What?" he asked. "A reminder that sometimes all it takes is one hug in the rain." The evening crowd had faded, leaving the Caldwell Center quieter than usual. The soft hum of the espresso machine and the faint rustle of pages were the only sounds left. Nina dimmed the lights near the shelves, preparing to close for the night, when Coulter stopped her with a gentle hand at her wrist. "Don't rush," he said. "Stay here with me a little longer." She raised a brow. "You planning to shelve books?" He chuckled. "I think you've got that under control. I just want a moment without the world watching." They walked together through the empty rows, past shelves lined with books donated from strangers who believed in the vision. At the far end, near the mural, Coulter stopped. The mural showed a woman in a raincoat embracing a man under a flickering street lamp, their forms painted in deep blues and golds. Around them, bright colors swirled into the shapes of children. Reading, neighbors laughing, strangers meeting. Nina's steps slowed. "You never told me who designed this." Coulter's lips curved faintly. "I did." Her eyes widened. "You." "I sketched it. An artist brought it to life." He looked at her, his voice soft. "It started with us, Nina. But it had to end with more than us. That's what this place is, proof that one act of kindness can ripple outward." Nina touched the painted figures, her fingertips grazing the outline of the embrace. "Turned a hug into a building. You turned a man into something human again," he countered. They sat down on the bench beneath the mural. For a while, neither spoke. Rain pattered softly against the windows, echoing the night they first met. Finally, Coulter broke the silence. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been if you just walked past me that night?" "All the time," Nina admitted. "I almost did." "What stopped you?" She met his gaze. "The sound. The way you were crying. It wasn't just sadness. It was like something inside you had been ripped out. And I knew I couldn't leave you there." He swallowed hard, eyes flicking away. "The hug. I didn't realize how much I needed it until it happened. No one had touched me without expectation in years. Not family. Not friends. Not even her." Nina laid her hand over his. "That's what makes it sacred. You didn't ask. I didn't explain. Just this." The rain outside grew heavier, a steady rhythm against the glass. Coulter shifted closer, his hand threading with hers. "You saved me that night. I just hugged you." He shook his head. "No. You reminded me I was still someone worth holding." Her throat tightened. "Coulter." He turned, cupping her cheek. "Don't ever underestimate what you did. Without that hug, there would be no us. No center. No second chance. Just a man drowning in his own silence." Nina leaned into his touch, her voice trembling. "And without you, I'd still be serving lattes and pretending I was content with smallness. You gave me a place to build something bigger than myself." They kissed then, not with urgency but with depth, a seal on the words they hadn't said aloud. Until now. His lips were warm, steady, familiar. Her body melted into his, the rain outside, amplifying the intimacy within. When they broke apart, Coulter rested his forehead against hers. One hug in the rain changed everything. Nina smiled faintly. And it still does. The front door creaked open, startling them. A teenage girl peeked in, her hoodie soaked through. She hesitated, clutching a dripping backpack. "We're closed," Nina began gently, but Coulter raised a hand. "No, we're not." He stood, approaching the girl with a reassuring smile. "Come in. You look like you need a place to be warm." The girl shuffled inside, eyes darting nervously around. Nina hurried to the counter, pouring a cup of hot chocolate and sliding it across. "Here," she said softly. "No charge." The girl's eyes filled with relief. "Thank you." As she settled into a chair, curling around the cup, Nina caught Coulter's gaze. His expression said everything. This was the purpose, the reason, the proof. When the girl finally left, warmer and steadier than she arrived, Coulter returned to Nina's side. "That's it," he whispered. "That's the whole story. A hug given, a hug received, and the ripple never stops." Nina rested her head against his shoulder. "Then let's keep it going." Coulter and Nina never needed to announce what they were. There were no staged photos, no magazine interviews, no carefully crafted statements. They walked together through the city like they always had, quietly. A billionaire and a waitress on paper, but in practice, two people who had learned to build something real in a world that thrived on pretense. No performance, just rhythm. The Caldwell Center had been open for 6 months when a young journalist from a local blog wandered in. He wasn't flashy, just a kid with a notepad and a curious look. He ordered a coffee, watched the bustle for a while, and finally approached the counter where Nina was pouring refills. "Excuse me," he said, pushing his glasses up nervously. "Can I ask you something?" Nina smiled. "Sure." He glanced around as if making sure no one was listening. "Is it true what they say, that this place exists because of a hug?" Nina froze for a moment, the pot still in her hand. She glanced over at Coulter, who was shelving books with a group of volunteers. He caught her eye and gave the faintest nod, a signal that said, "Tell it if you want. It's yours to share." She set the pot down and leaned against the counter. "Yes," she said softly. "That's true." The journalist blinked. "Really? Just a hug?" Her eyes softened, drifting toward the mural at the back wall, the one of 2 figures under a rain-soaked lamp. Not just a hug. It was a moment. A choice. He needed it and I gave it. Everything that followed grew out of that. The young man scribbled quickly, then asked, "And now it's all this?" He gestured around it. The books, the cafe, the laughter drifting from the poetry corner. Nina's lips curved. "Now it's all this. Because sometimes the smallest act is the one that changes everything." Later that night, after closing, Nina and Coulter lingered in the quiet space. The chairs were stacked, the lights dimmed, the city's hum faint through the glass doors. Coulter walked over, slipping his arm around her shoulders. "You told the truth," he murmured. "I did. And you didn't dress it up." "Why would I?" she asked, leaning against him. "It's not about spectacle. It's about rhythm." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "Exactly." They strolled through the empty rows, past the mural, past the counter where strangers became family, until they reached the front doors. Outside, rain had started again, not harsh, not storming, just steady. Coulter reached for the umbrella, but Nina shook her head. "Leave it. Let's walk." So they stepped into the rain together, hand in hand, their strides matching naturally. Cameras. No audience. No need for anyone to understand. Because their story was never about performance. It was about rhythm. And so, a hug in the rain became more than comfort. It became a beginning. Nina and Coulter didn't need headlines or crowds or performances. They built something real. A rhythm between 2 people, and a place where strangers could find warmth when the world felt cold. Sometimes, the smallest act of kindness leaves the deepest mark. Now it's your turn. Do you believe one hug can change a life? Comment below, I believe in kindness, so more people can carry this message forward. And if this story touched you, don't leave without clicking subscribe to join our community. Here at Mr. Hearthline Stories. Your likes, comments, and shares tell YouTube this story matters, and help it reach someone who may need this reminder tonight. Because love isn't performance. It's rhythm. And rhythm begins with us.